Hi, my name is Dan Taylor, and this is the first class of the Stoics. Welcome. Now, because of coronavirus and lockdown, this class comes to you from my sofa, so we could call this Stoics on a sofa. I hope you're all well. Maybe at some point towards the end of this course, something miraculous might occur, and the format of this course might change. But for now, remote, and let's hope. But as the Stoics would tell us, we shouldn't hope too much. Instead, we need to be vigilant about the vicissitudes of fate. Now, in this first class, my goal is to just introduce you to the Stoics. I want us to start thinking about what it means to be stoical, what that might mean to you. And then we're going to start thinking about where the Stoics came from. We're going to think a little bit about the ancient world. And I'm going to introduce you briefly to one of the earliest Stoic. And we'll use this to get started in thinking about what characterizes Stoicism. And this is something that we're going to be doing over the rest of the course. But first of all, I thought I might try and drop you into a few different places so that we can start thinking about what the Stoics are trying to do. Okay, so the year is 300 BC. A weary man is travelling for work. He's aged 30. He's come from Cyprus, and he's travelling on a commercial voyage from Phoenicia, where he hopes to sell purple dye to the Athenians. But, as you can tell from this image by Turner, disaster strikes. He is shipwrecked right by the Piraeus, which is the ancient port of Athens. Miraculously, this man, Zeno, from the town of Citium, survives. He makes his way to Athens, still perhaps traumatized by the near-death experience. In the booksellers, he hears a book being read aloud, Memorabilia by Xenophon. And you can probably guess from the title, Memorabilia. It's about memories, remembering, and it narrates people from the past, people like Socrates. Zeno is listening, and he asks the bookseller, where can he find men like Socrates today? As he asks, a rather frugal-looking, dishevelled man hurries by. Again, we can only assume because we don't know what these people really look like, but we can guess that this frugal and dishevelled man was Crates the Cynic. Zeno decides to follow Crates and to follow the school of the Cynics. And while nothing survives of what Zeno of Citium would eventually write, the annals of history record one underlying principle which is at the heart of his work: to live according to nature. A nature that, as we see in an image like this, isn't always hospitable to human need. Our next moment in time, we shift forward. The year is 41 AD, 3.5 centuries after Zeno's shipwreck. A Roman man looks out at the wilderness and the sea from a lonely hilltop tower. As he looks down, this man recalls that he's survived many dangerous near-death experiences. Bad asthma from an early age, tuberculosis which nearly killed him, and at least 2 death sentences from a Roman emperor. Eventually, this man in question will die from the 3rd death sentence. A life of great highs and great lows. An early philosophical training. Success at a young age. Seneca, becoming senator at the age of 25. But also forever being on the move. Being taken from his mother aged 5 in Spain and brought to Rome by his aunt. Later forced to Egypt, now in exile, looking down from this point at the sea in Corsica. Seneca's young and ultimately only son has just died weeks before. His mother is broken by bereavement because Seneca is in exile. That means that she will probably not ever see him again. And so Seneca writes to her in response. He says, "It was nature's intention that there should be no need of great equipment for a good life. Every individual can make himself happy. External goods are of trivial importance and without much influence in either direction. Prosperity does not elevate the sage, and adversity does not depress him, for he has always made the effort to rely as much as possible on himself, and to derive all delight from within himself. Elsewhere, Seneca remarks in a book called On Providence, "Despise poverty. No man lives as poor as he was born. Despise pain. Either it will cease or you will cease. Despise death. It either ends you or takes you elsewhere. Despise fortune. I have given her no weapon that can reach the mind." Fast forward our third scene. The year is 1965 AD, nearly 2 millennia after Seneca. The Skyhawk jet of a US Navy officer is shot down on an attack mission over North Vietnam. The pilot manages to eject, but he is captured. For the next 7 years, including 4 of those years in solitary confinement, James Stockdale is held as a prisoner of war at a notorious prison, the Hoa Lo prison, where he is routinely tortured and horrifically beaten. During his time in prison, James Stockdale frequently has flashbacks of a philosophy book that he studied whilst at college, the Handbook of Epictetus. As Stockdale recounts, Epictetus was telling his students that there can be no such thing as being the victim of another. You can only be a victim of yourself. It's all in how you discipline your mind. So far in these 3 instances, we're seeing, or I hope we're starting to see, a commonality of approach. It's an outlook held by people in many different periods and many different times. Now, I want you to think here about, some of the characteristics and some of the feelings and some of the ideas that were evoked in some of those experiences and reactions to those experiences, and what you think is at play here so far. As you think about this, you could also think about what you so far understand about Stoicism as well. Certainly one thing that I think is being accentuated here is a kind of detachment, a focus on inner strength. We get this in different ways. Certainly in Epictetus, as read by James Stockdale, or even in Seneca, there is this kind of sense of working out what is in your control and what isn't in your control. And often for the Stoics, what is in our control is simply our ideas or our judgments about things that happen to us. Those events themselves are not in our control. Now, this isn't just about working out what we can control and what we can't control. There's something else that also happens here. We get this in a very evocative phrase from the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who talks about the need to fortify an inner citadel. Just as later on, the Renaissance humanist Michel de Montaigne will talk about having a back room in your mind, a place of solitary detachment and reflection. Thousands of years earlier, Marcus talks about the need of a point of inner strength, a place where you can be, which is protected from the hustle and bustle and flux of unstable events, of dangerous passions, of fears, of hostile forces, of adverse fate that can take away the things you love. Having some point within you in which you are safe. Now, you might be thinking here that with all of this talk of detachment, it's something that might sound quite self-interested. Something that could just be about reprogramming yourself so that you can be a more productive or well-adjusted person in the 21st century. And this kind of 21st century Stoicism is something that I'm going to talk more about in a moment. But one thing that I want to emphasize here too is that our Stoics aren't just about looking within, they're also looking somewhere else. So here you can see quite a cool graphic. I don't know, the movement of time and space. I'll show you something else. Now, our Stoics aren't just interested in using their minds to understand their own feelings and ideas, but it's about understanding our place in nature, what Zeno of Citium mentioned just earlier. And this is really important. So we think about our Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who, at least in our timeline of things, is writing in the 1st and 2nd century AD. He talks about the need to not just cultivate an outlook of what is within, but also what is without and what is on the outside. And so he writes these words whilst on a military campaign in Pannonia, in areas of what is now Central and Eastern Europe. He says, "Look down from a height on the countless herds of men and their countless rituals, and their various journeys through storm and calm, and the many different beings who are born, live together, and are gone. Imagine too the life lived by others long ago, and the life that will be lived after your departure. And the life that is being lived at this very moment among alien peoples. And how many are not even aware of your name? And how many will soon forget it? And how many who now perhaps are praising you will very soon be deriding you? And reflect that neither remembrance, nor fame, nor anything else, whatever it is, worth a passing for." These things are not worth a passing or deep thoughts as a Roman emperor, continually surrounded by flatterers, surrounded by ambitious generals and rivals. Because Marcus cultivates or sets out to cultivate an inner citadel in which he can look out on the world. And one of the very interesting things about his outlook is that it ends up resulting in a kind of deep compassion for the frailties of others, and therefore the frailties that we see within us too. When we see other people's frailties, when we see our own, this should lead us not into a kind of misanthropy or melancholic withdrawal. Instead, it should compel us to, out of a sense of duty, to be engaged in the lives of others, to value friendships, to value communal life, to value politics, to recognize and celebrate what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls our shared incompleteness. Marcus says elsewhere, and these quotes are from what is now called the Meditations, but this was a private journal that he wrote in Greek to himself. And one of the names for it, because it's untitled, is To Himself, which is a really interesting title. Marcus says, "What a tiny part of the boundless abyss of time has been allotted to each of us, and this is soon vanished in eternity. What a tiny part of the universal substance and the universal soul. How tiny in the whole earth the mere clod on which you creep." Now it's interesting to kind of think about, I don't know what the effect is of listening to these admonitory statements. Is it deflationary? Is he trying to make us feel sad or bad? I don't think it's part of that. We have to remember, and what's going to be interesting about Stoics is that they're going to actually come from quite a wide range of social backgrounds, is that these are all remarks that are about enabling us to see things with greater clarity and lucidity, to enable us to appreciate that as beings of nature, there is so much that we can enjoy within our lives once we work out how to value the things that are really nourishing to us. And one of the things that the Stoics and people influenced by Stoicism commonly warn us against is devoting our lives simply to the pursuit of wealth, of hedonistic pleasure, of honor, of other people's esteem. No. these aren't going to give us a lasting sense of contentment. For that, we need to not just look within, but we need to look without. We need to look at what's around us. And Seneca will say we need to realize and make the most of the time that is in front of us. There's a lot more to say about this. If this is piquing your curiosity, you are on the right course. Okay, I want to ask you now, what comes to mind when you think of a Stoic, and when we think of somebody being accused of being Stoic or stoical in this day and age? Now, one thing that might come to mind is the British stiff upper lip. To be Stoic is to be stiff, is to be cold, is to be emotionally frugal, is to be unloving, is to be distant, is to be aloof. Well, it's interesting to think about this, because it's not so untrue. Certainly when we think about traditional British masculinity of the Victorian period, Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, like Epictetus, were widely read, were a part of the education of men in this period, of the way in which people understood their emotions, but of course being read in a certain way. And when we think about some of the calls to be so detached in Marcus or Seneca, to despise poverty, to almost despise everything, to despise fortune, this seems to be making quite great demands on us as human beings. We are fragile, we are flawed. How can we do this? Unless in some way we cut some rich and deep and feeling part of ourselves off. These are questions that don't have easy answers. But when we think about what comes to mind with the word Stoic, and perhaps you or someone you know might have been accused of being stoical in a kind of negative way, it's this cold, unemotional person. It's somebody who doesn't... It's not just that they want to cut themselves off from pain, they also want to cut themselves off from pleasure. But what I want to say at this point is that we shouldn't hold on too much to this. Well, it keeps in mind, but Stoics, or in Stoic philosophy, especially in the ethical dimension that this course is going to prioritize looking at, the goal isn't to rid yourself of all emotions, it's rather to work out and identify the causes of painful emotions, of fear, of hatred. That's what really counts. The apatheia. To not be disturbed by negative emotions. And this is something that we're going to look at in a second. Maybe this is why Stoic philosophy has been so compelling, and of all the parts of the history of philosophy, Stoic philosophy in our time remains most popular. Most books are coming out about it. There's most live interest in it. There's most work looking at how it's relevant today. And maybe part of that is because of our continued need as human beings in this age, in previous ages, and in future ages, to understand how to deal with fear, how to deal with anger, how to deal with self-loathing, how to deal with anxiety, how to deal with hostility. And the Stoics offer powerful and compelling answers to this. Now, we might find it rich to just look at some dictionary definitions. So this is from Merriam-Webster. I'm just going to make it a bit brighter. And again, we see this double play. The one who is indifferent to pleasure or pain, someone who's affectless, who's cold, or indifference to cold, someone who's aloof. But then the philosophical school, Zeno of Citium, who we heard about just earlier. So there are two things happening. I think one way that really visualizes what we're talking about with this kind of detached thinker is a sculpture that some of you will know already by Rodin, called The Thinker. Of a man, and there's a lot to say about masculinity here, who's looking down, who is looking within, who is who is not thinking about the world around him, but instead is trying to make sense of his own judgments, of his own thoughts and his own feelings about those. And by doing this work, and it is a form of work, a form of exercise, mental training. And Seneca talks about, using philosophy as a kind of gym of wrestling with adversity, kind of training that will not only help us withstand adversity, but be able to kind of take stock and recognize what things really matter, and use that philosophy so that we can live better, so that philosophy becomes a way of life. Now, I'm dropping in a couple of quite leading phrases here. These are two books that have come out very recently about Stoicism. Both of them are really good. The one that I really like is the John Sellers book, and I highly recommend this to all of you. But we'll notice just on these two covers that this is about applying Stoicism to modern life. That the Stoics say, unlike studying Hegel or Kant, are not just going to teach us how to understand our own thoughts or how to understand human knowledge, but they're going to teach us how to live. Now that is quite remarkable. There are not so many branches of philosophy nowadays, or in the past, that even set out to make these sorts of promises. And certainly I think this kind of reflects on the popularity of Stoicism at the moment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go over some modern Stoicisms, and then I'm going to clarify about what this course is going to do and how it fits in within this modern Stoic stuff. So, there's kind of been a Stoic revival recently, but probably there's always been a revival. We'll talk about its reception in a future class. But there's been a Stoic week that's been running for a few years, where people are encouraged to live like a Stoic and to talk about the psychological benefits that ensue as a result. A really good piece on this is by John Sellers, who's involved in this. I'm going to put this link up on Moodle. If you're not sure what Moodle is, I'll tell you what that is in a moment. This is a really good guide. There is a Stoicon, like a Stoic convention, which takes place every year. This one would have been in Toronto. I can't imagine it's going to take place. But that's interesting. Because normally conventions, you get that, for comics, comic books, science fiction. But here it's for Stoics. Again, it'd be great if this happened for other philosophers. Some of you will know that my guy is Spinoza, and I see myself as a disciple of Spinoza. I'm only half joking. And I would be very glad if there was a Spinoza con, but there is not, or a Kant con, but there is only a Stoicon. There are all sorts of things online. Daily Stoicism, there's a Stoic publication. This is about coronavirus and stocking up. Again, there are so many people working on this area. It's so energetic, it's so interesting. And that's fascinating, isn't it? To think about how a philosophy can compel that. One of the parts of modern Stoicism that is so interlinked with modern needs and concerns is the work of Ryan Holiday. The Daily Stoic, which is a website, and it's become a book, and it's become a journal. And a lot of it's about these guides on how to live, but there is a real emphasis on how it might makes you kind of almost like physically as well as mentally stronger. This is going to be good for your career. This is going to not just make you kind of feel less pain, as it were. It's going to make you a more kind of proactive citizen. Now, this is from the Daily Stoic website. And this is a really interesting website, and there's a lot of really good stuff on there. But it's interesting about the direction it then goes in. So if you kind of look at this, you'll see that there's medallions, a memento mori signet ring. It looks quite cool, don't get me wrong. But these are all products for sale. And you can go on the Daily Stoic website and you can have a look and see how expensive they are. They're pretty expensive, I'll tell you that. So maybe there's something interesting, or maybe, I don't know, disquieting? I'm not sure. You make up your own mind about this. This just simply tells us that Stoicism is being used in a very modern way as a life hack. A productivity hack. Well, no, it's a really kind of modern focus. It's going to help. Here, the author talks about it helping us to handle stress. This is from LinkedIn. It's a career hack. We're going to get promoted. So I don't know what your ambitions are, what your aims are with this Stoic course. This is something that we can also talk about. But, maybe as a result of this, you might get a brand new career. You'll make it hacks into your life. Now, let me just tell you that this isn't the way that I'm going to teach this Stoic course. I think all this stuff is interesting and it's relevant, and you can probably get a lot from it. But I don't like the phrase hack, because that suggests to me a shortcut. And I'm a bit wary about bringing our Stoics too rapidly into the 21st century. Yes, their concerns are like ours, but their context is not like ours. And there are many things that they think which are very different from what we think. So whilst I'm going to put an emphasis on teaching the ethics, the counsel, the consolations of our Stoic philosophers, something that I am going to emphasize is the difference as well. Part of that reflects my own background. I've taught a lot of history. I'm interested in the history of philosophy. But also, I'm just a little bit wary about using very different philosophy in a way that kind of sort of reinforces the current cultural and economic order that we have. I don't know if we should be reading Marcus Aurelius in order to get promotion at work. I sometimes think what makes philosophy so intoxicating is how it can provide completely different perspectives on the familiar, and it can introduce us to the unfamiliar. So I'm not sure about this. Anyway, there's lots of things about Stoicism which are quite cool and which do have a place in modern culture. So if you've already been doing a bit of research into Stoicism, you probably will have come across a reference to the Serenity Prayer, which I think appears in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. And this prayer has been produced and reproduced in different forms. You can see it here on a little coin. Again, it's quite cool. God grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Now, it's amazing how slogans take on a life of their own, and there are lots of really cool tattoos basically with this on. You can just Google it. There's some brilliant tattoos. Okay, so how am I going to teach this course? So in the next kind of 5 minutes, I'm just going to talk about the structure. Really, this is what I plotted out. When we talk on Monday, you can tell me if there's something that you would like a particular emphasis on. I've also changed things around just a little bit from the earlier outline that I sent to some of you. Okay, so because it's on the Stoics, what I want to do in our course is give you a really strong foundation in Stoic philosophy of the Greek and Roman period. But then I'm going to do something different on top of that. So let me just tell you about the key stuff. What we're going to do in the first 5 weeks is I'm going to give you a foundation in the Stoics. The guy on the left there is Cicero. Cicero, a Roman politician. He's not a Stoic, but he writes a lot about Stoic philosophy. And he's one of our earliest reliable sources that still survives of what the early Stoics, and what the middle Stoics, these are the Stoics who move, and the school kind of moves from Athens to Rome, thought. These sources like Zeno, they just don't survive. So we have to look in different places. So we're going to start by working out what these early Stoics thought and why they thought it. That's what we're going to do next week. But we're then going to move on to what I would say is the good stuff. We're going to have a week looking at Seneca, who you met just earlier, a fantastic writer, a wonderful thinker. We're going to look at Epictetus, a slave who becomes free and who then produces some of the most engaging and exciting forms of everyday Stoic philosophy. Often when you get these guides like, Stoicism for modern life, blah, 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 they're usually using Epictetus. But Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, is another who we're also going to spend a week looking at. An intriguing man, and his meditations are, in my view, some of the best. I mean, it might sound really strange because there's why should it sound strange? No, it doesn't need to. For me personally, when I try and recommend friends or people that are just coming to philosophy what to read, I normally say Marcus's Meditations. I think they're beautiful. I think they're fascinating. That, alongside Plato's Symposium and Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, for me, are the three wonderful works. So we're going to look at these first of all. So this is what we start with. So next week, after week 5. Okay, So that's what we're going to do in the first part. So far so traditional. But I think it's important that you guys know what the Stoics are really thinking and what they're saying, so that you can then have this in mind confidently when we move on to some more unfamiliar stuff, the kind of thing that you would never get on a Stoics course anywhere else. So what I want to then do in the next part of the course is think about similarities and differences in other religious and philosophical traditions. I also want to explore development and influence of Stoical philosophy in later work. Let me just explain this. So, from Marcus Aurelius, we're going to move on to the Book of Ecclesiastes. Now, some of you will know from my Martha Nussbaum course that I started reading this and really thinking about this quite a lot recently. I didn't originally intend to put it in the course, but I actually have changed my mind. I'm going to. Okay, so hopefully you'll be grateful for this. Now, the author, the anonymous author of Ecclesiastes, isn't a Stoic philosopher. Of course he's not. This is a work of the Old Testament. But I think there are some very interesting parallels and some important differences with Stoic philosophy. And I'm doing this not just to do kind of comparative work, because, and this is something I'll explain in a moment, there are some underlying processes of Stoic thinking which I think we can observe in other traditions, and which therefore mean that we don't necessarily need to talk about Stoicism as something that is only in Greece and Rome. That there is something about looking at the world in a Stoic way which goes across borders. This is something that I'm going to need to explain and fill out. So we're going to, in week 6, we look at Ecclesiastes. In week 7, we go even further. We're going to look at the Dhammapada. An important early work of Buddhism. So we're going to look at, and when we think Buddhism here, this is really like philosophical Buddhism. Again, did Siddhartha Gautama read Stoic philosophy? No, he didn't. But there are some important parallels and some important differences. We're also, and this is probably more out there, we're going to look at the Rubaiyat by the 11th century Persian astronomer and mathematician Umar Khayyam. Now, this is kind of quite melancholy, world-weary poetry. It's got quite a materialist outlook. A friend recently summarized this to me as wine, women, and boys. And it's interesting how the Rubaiyat, because it's translated in late Victorian England, takes on a new life. It has a different life in our culture. We're going to be looking at the Victorian Fitzgerald translation, but we're actually going to look at a more up-to-date translation, which is much more philosophically sharp. Again, we're going to look at similarities and differences compared to early Stoic work, and we're going to develop this Stoic outlook. So this as before. And then we're on slightly stronger ground, because we're going to look at a real Stoic revival that takes place in early modern Europe. Well, in the center, you have a vanitas image. We're going to look, Stoic philosophy begins to be expounded in the 16th and 17th century. There is the work of a guy called Justus Lipsius. But what we're going to look at when we look at Stoicism in early modern Europe, 16th, 17th century Europe, is we're going to look at work by the essayist Montaigne. We're going to look at, in the visual arts, we're going to look at the vanitas, like what you see in front of you, those images with the skulls. We're going to look at Memento Mori. We're going to look at some metaphysical poetry by John Donne. And we are going to look at Shakespeare. The reading for this week will actually be Shakespeare. I haven't decided what. It'll either be Hamlet or King Lear. And then we're going to move on to Spinoza. Spinoza I love, and Spinoza is very influenced by Stoic philosophy. And this influence is something that I want us to explore. And we're going to look at the traces of Stoic philosophy in Spinoza, but we'll probably talk briefly about it in Descartes as well. Then, because it's an 11-week course, there really should be something in the middle, but we're going to just move on instead. We're going to look at Viktor Frankl, somebody who survived being in the Nazi death camps, and in a work called Man's Search for Meaning, how he uses kind of Stoical elements to forge a powerful philosophy and a powerful psychology, which is fitted out to deal with the misery, the horrific suffering of things like the Holocaust. But whereas somebody like Albert Camus saw the same misery and talked about the absurd, what makes Frankl really interesting is that he talks about the search for meaning. He doesn't give up on the possibility of finding some real universal meaning amidst all this suffering for human beings, and that's powerful. And that I take as an important modern form of Stoicism. So this is our structure. I hope it sounds of interest. This is what we can talk about on Monday. Probably what we'll do at the end of that class is we'll talk about where Stoicism is going in this day and age. Jordan Peterson, not a popular man for many on the left, takes a lot of his work reflects Stoicism. Martha Nussbaum, who many of us have studied and talked about together before, also is heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy. So I want us in this final class to think about Stoicism today and the different directions of Stoicism. Is it just simply about dishing out pat and glib consolations on how to live in a quite an ego-centered, kind of way, which is very individualistic? Or in Nussbaum's direction, is it something about that will help us learn how to live with each other and to live in a more cooperative and loving and just fashion? Does it have to be individualistic, or does it have the possibility of being communitarian as well? Of course, I think all of these are very pressing concerns, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to teach the Stoic course this summer, because of our situation, because of coronavirus, because of all of the pressures and fears that we've been surrounded by at different points. Because for many of us, many of you, we have either lost dear ones, or we have been, and we still are very close to losing those people. And how we deal with that, especially in a statement like this quite recently from the World Health Organization, that coronavirus might not go away. How do we deal with that? Now, this course isn't setting out to give you some remedies to kind of confront coronavirus, but we're going to think about how people in different times and places have confronted the uncertainty and adversity of life. That's our goal, basically. That's what we're going to do. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about this course. Well, I'll tell you about the structure. There is this thing called Moodle that we will use. It's basically a course website. Probably you have used it before. If you want to get to it quite quickly, you just type this in to your browser. learn.marywardcentre.ac.uk, and then there's this whole palaver about how do you log in. You need a username and a password. Well, the process hopefully is not too complicated. Your username on Moodle, and the Moodle page should be ready by, I would hope, by the time that you watch this recording. Your username on Moodle will be your first name and your last name, all one word, all lowercase. And then your password is your first name and the first letter of your surname, but that's all in capital letters. So this guy on the right is Marcus Aurelius. So if he wants to get onto Moodle, he's doing his journal, he's meditating, he's thinking about being a mere clod of earth, and he thinks, right, I want to read more, I want to watch more about this. His username is Marcus Aurelius, as you can see in front of you. Password is Marcusa, Marcus A. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff on Stoic philosophy out there. There's one thing that I really recommend to you. John Sellers' Lessons in Stoicism. I think it came out last year. It's a really good book. It's quite short. Just look out for whatever John Sellers has written, because it's just very good. I'm going to put more resources up on Moodle, but this is the book that I would suggest that you read. I mentioned the Pigliucci book earlier. I think it's good, but actually I think this is good enough for you guys. And then what I want us to do is focus on reading the primary text. I think we're going to get way more out of it than reading these guides, that are full of life hacks and mind hacks and all that. Let's not look at that too much. Okay. All right. So that's my introduction to the course structure. In this next part, I'm going to just talk to you about where the Stoics come from, and then I'm going to set out some questions for us to discuss. So let's go back to our image from Rodin of the Stoic, of this man. And next week we're going to talk about why it's mainly men, although there were some female Stoic philosophers. What is this Stoic sage looking detached? What does that represent? And what are we dealing with so far? What are the key things that we need to keep in mind at this stage? Well, so far, the Stoic philosopher is emphasizing what I'd say is a form of self-knowledge. It's understanding your own ideas and your own feelings and what causes those ideas and feelings. Understanding your attachments and why you're attached to them. Understanding your values and why you value them. Understanding your goals and why you are heading towards them. Understanding your habits and whether they're good for you. Self-knowledge. This is really important. And we're going to come back to this shortly in relation to Socrates. But another thing I want to emphasize, and this probably is my own reading, is compassion. When Marcus looks out on the men, the human beings of this world, as if he's kind of traveling, from space, looking from the perspective of, of a satellite going around the Earth. On one level, this can be read as something that is quite cold and detached, but I actually see in it a kind of universal, cosmopolitan awareness and empathy for other human beings who, on this kind of cosmic perspective, are of all equal value. There is a deep compassion in recognizing that people are frail, that people are caught up by their emotions in different ways, just like us. You're not blaming, you're not hating, you're not seeing the world in an us versus them, but simply in a cosmic and universal usness. And that is important. And that leads to the third thing that I'm going to emphasize probably throughout this course, which is that the Stoics talk about the need to live with nature and that we are of nature, we are nature. So what does that mean? Well, let's think about it by what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean, as per the Christian tradition, that we, that God has made us in His image. And we are above the animals, and we can use the animals and nature for what we like. No, we are of nature too. We are momentary clods of earth, momentary clusters of forces. Our existence have, to a large degree, come about by wonderful, miraculous chances. Now that's nature. We are not mini gods. We do not have secret access to what the divine wishes to reveal. We are of nature. Now, what the Stoic does with self-knowledge and compassion and the wish to live with nature is to dedicate her or his attention to cultivating the strength of their mind, cultivating virtue. Virtue in Greek, arete, is skill, a skillful mind. Cultivating an excellent mental state, a skillful mental state. And what does that mean? Well, it kind of means what we've got just above. Deep self-knowledge, deep awareness through yourself of what causes the passions and ideas and values and reactions of human beings. Living with nature means to value and wish to understand nature scientifically. And the Stoics were very interested in the sciences, in physics. They're also very interested in logic. But it also means one other thing. One thing that has been an implication and that you might have had in the back of your mind, but it hasn't become apparent yet. But when we talk about self-knowledge, when we talk about looking at human beings as being all universally equal, we're really making a big departure from the sources of knowing before. Superstitious, theological, mythological. It's a big break. It's a materialist break, and that really counts. Okay, I'm going to give you a quote from Seneca just to stir the blood, and then we're going to talk about this Greek world in which they came. And this is a nice way of contrasting modern philosophy with what the Stoics are trying to do. So philosophy as a way of life. Seneca says, "There are indeed mistakes made through the fault of our advisers, who teach us how to debate and not how to live. There are also mistakes made by students who come to their teachers to develop not their souls but their wits. Thus, philosophy, the study of wisdom, has become philology, the study of words. What we're sensing here, and what some of you might know if you've looked at Plato in the past, is the distant voice of Socrates. Socrates attacking what were called the sophists, people who taught philosophy for money and who taught rhetoric so that people could produce well-crafted speeches, not in order to help others pursue the truth, but in order to win arguments and get votes. Socrates was very worried about this. And Seneca, we still get the same sense here too, that philosophy always has something deeper in the back of its mind. Right, let's talk about the ancient world. Okay, so who were the Stoics? We could also use this landing screen here in case you're watching. If you want to take a quick break and pause and get a cup of tea or what have you, please do that, and then come back here. I'm going to have a glug of water as well. Right, so who were the Stoics? Well, I mentioned this before about thinking about what philosophy is and what this kind of philosophy is in terms of what came before that. I know that's quite a woolly thing to say, isn't it? Okay, in the background is an image of the Epic of Gilgamesh, thought to be the earliest surviving work of literature, like written literature. Now, what we get in these really ancient forms of literature from like Sumeria or later Egypt are writings that are, in some sense, historical, because they're normally dealing with people that in those times were thought to be real individuals, but they often readily conflate images of the divine, of visiting the underworld, of interacting with giants and gods, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or this great flood, which we believe kind of informs the story of Noah's Ark later in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The earliest forms of writing, if they're not related to accountancy and bookkeeping and what have you, are narrating myths, kind of great historical myths. And this certainly is the Greek world. The gods who direct men's lives, human lives. If heroic individuals in their downfall, literally. Story of Icarus and Daedalus. Those who gain the power of flight, but fly too close to the sun. An allegory of man's ambitions overstepping his capacities. Has a bearing on the story of Prometheus, the thief of fire, and the punishment of Prometheus and Epimetheus. Story of Pandora's box. I won't go into that now. I could easily get distracted in all of this mythology. If you look at Pandora's box. But not just in the Greek tradition. Okay, Brad Pitt. But in other traditions too. If we think about something like the Old Testament, we think about the story of the Hebrew peoples. The ways in which these stories of something like Moses are very likely good historical records in a lot of ways about captivity and so forth. But then conflate and maybe involve additions of more miraculous material, like the parting of the Red Sea and so forth. How do we separate mythology from what happened? And what really matters for writing? Okay, well, this is the Greek world. And you can see on the left is the Roman world. So really this map kind of is where the action takes place in our first few weeks. Now, for the ancient Greeks, a big part of their literature, Hesiod and Homer, is about the story of military battles and military history, war with the Trojans, which probably does have a historical basis, but frequently involves the gods as major characters. Greek literature, Greek tragedy is about the gods. And what are these tragedies and what are these tales about? And what can human beings do within them? Well, often not very much. They're victims of fate. Fate compels them in one way or another. The gods meddle in their lives for their own vicarious sport. Human beings have little power. They're pushed around like boats with sails open on the sea. So what's interesting about the earliest philosophers, what we now call the pre-Socratics, is the way in which they tried to make a step beyond and away from mythology, to thinking about what is the underlying basis of things. Thales, thought to be the first, believed it was water. And we can understand that. That seems very relatable, doesn't it? In terms of what makes up the bodies of human beings or other animals, or the sea, or how weather systems work. This image, some of you will have seen it before, is of Thales, the absent-minded philosopher, one evening wandering and staring at the stars. And because he's looking up at the stars, he doesn't see what's right in front of him. A big hole, and he crashes within. This is also in Aesop's fables. Our earliest philosophers are concerned with trying to explain man's place in nature, the human place in nature. Knowledge is a value in itself. We're not going to use it to live better lives. We're going to use it simply to understand why things are the way they are. And there are various kind of philosophers who come up in this tradition. Some emphasize water, some emphasize atoms, some emphasize, a mixture of things. Now, this is a great image. Again, you'll know it, the School of Athens. Our eyes led to the center under the arches, a man in red and a man in blue. The older man with the red robe is Plato. He points upwards. The younger man, sort of with his hand kind of more direct gesture towards the ground, is Aristotle. There are kind of two different modes of philosophy here. Plato, the student of Socrates, who we'll mention in a second, who emphasizes that knowledge is of the infinite and the universal, and it's perceived by our rational minds. And it involves a kind of contempt for the physical senses and sense perception. Aristotle, by contrast, thinks the opposite. He thinks that we learn and understand by observing what's around us and drawing out classifications of things that exist. Aristotle is amazing in this respect. He classifies everything. Literature, drama, poetry, metaphysics. He even does a lot of early biological work, separating animals into different species like vertebrates and invertebrates. All of this stuff happens with him. It's a completely different response. He's also a student of Plato. Now, Aristotle kind of continues the line of people like Thales and the pre-Socratics, using knowledge as a departure away from mythology and in order to understand things in themselves. Knowledge as its own good. But this is kind of different from Socrates, who really is important to the Stoic tradition and really is important for just everything. Socrates here, this is, some of you will know the story of Socrates. From Athens, he is condemned, he's found guilty for corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety. Trumped up charges. Or maybe not. In terms of the radical effects of the philosophy that he practiced. He's forced to drink the hemlock. And this is a painting, the hemlock is in front of him. His friends are weeping all around him. They're trying to persuade him not to drink the hemlock, to go into exile, blah, blah, blah. But he is going to drink the hemlock because he doesn't fear death. And this is really important. There is a big part of his arguments that he presents in this dialogue, which the painting's from, which is called the Apology, are about obeying the laws of Athens, but really it's about not fearing death. So for Socrates, philosophy isn't just about understanding things are made of fire or water. Okay, that might be useful. But for him, philosophy is a way of life, and we use philosophy to understand ourselves. There's that famous line of his, the unexamined life is not worth living. And what Socrates feels compelled to do is, he's been told by the oracle that he is the wisest man, but he doesn't believe this, so he's determined to find somebody who's more wise. And that's why what he does, and this is the Socratic method, is he engages in dialogue with people that he meets in public places, because he's determined to find somebody more wise than he is. So he asks him questions about morality and the nature of things. But what he often does is he exposes the contradictions in what people think. All the while he says that he doesn't know anything. I know that I know nothing. All that I know is that I know nothing. He also describes himself as a midwife to help other people give birth to their ideas. But actually there is a big positive program to Socrates, and that's the method, the interest in philosophy as a way of life. Now Socrates sees philosophy as having great use. It's going to help us become less attached to our bodies and our sense perceptions, and it's going to help us cultivate our minds so that we can recognize and value what is really good for us. Wisdom. Again, not just by involving an understanding of our place in nature, but understanding what beauty is and what goodness is. Now Socrates does his philosophy in the marketplace, in the busiest part of Athens. It's very public philosophy. It's not ivory tower. Nowadays, if we think about the word agoraphobia, which is something that we might be feeling during the lockdown, the agora is the marketplace where Socrates is discussing philosophy. It's sometimes called the gadfly of Athens, like the horsefly, the pest, because he asks inconvenient and difficult questions. He'd often ask these questions to quite wealthy people. Now, he was relatively lower class. He was also often described as being physically ugly, which in Greek society is kind of reflects a kind of lower class status, because it's a very elitist society. It's a patriarchal society. It's a slave owning society. Socrates asks inconvenient questions. Here he's speaking to quite a well-off guy. Are you not ashamed that you give your attention to acquiring as much money as possible, and similarly with reputation and honour, and give no attention or thought to truth and understanding and the perfection of your soul? All day long I will never cease to settle here, there and everywhere, rousing, persuading and reproving every one of you. He's a nuisance. Now this has an important basis for Stoicism later, especially when we think of that anecdote at the very beginning of Zeno of Citium, where he is listening about the life of Socrates and he wants to find somebody like Socrates. Socrates is such a key early inspiration for this school. We can see Socrates on the left, and then this is an image of Plato, his student, on the right. So Socrates talks about philosophy being a training for dying. This is really important for our course. And he also says elsewhere in his final moments that are recorded in the Apology, which is written by Plato, that a good man cannot be harmed in life or in death, that there is something about our inner virtue or character which is impervious. It's like an inner citadel to adversity of all kinds. And this is really interesting. Those of you that did the Martha Nussbaum course last term, we and she says a lot about this. Can we be harmed? Well, yes, we can. Her argument is that we are fragile. Philosophy shouldn't try to make us invulnerable. So there's an interesting question for us early on. Are the Stoics going to try and do this? Are they going to try and make us cold? Now, this is an image of Plato in his school later on called the Academy. Philosophy becomes, Plato is from a very well-off aristocratic family, and philosophy starts becoming almost more professionalized thereafter. And this is different from what the Stoics are going to do. Let me just bring together a couple of things quite quickly, and then I'm going to tell you where the Stoics come in. So we're talking so far about the world of Greek philosophy. We've been talking about the pre-Socratics and what they're about, and something that we're seeing in Socrates is that philosophy instead shouldn't be about just knowledge as an end in itself, but it's about human flourishing. It's about philosophy being a way of life, as being a kind of training and preparation to live well, to live beautifully. Now we could say that this kind of philosophy, and you get it in other places, get it to a degree in Aristotle, is aimed at human flourishing or contentment. Now after Socrates, philosophy goes in different directions in ancient Athens. Plato, the Academy, and Plato is looking upwards, like in the School of Athens, that knowledge is in something that is beyond sense perception. It's in these forms that exist in their own reality. There's Aristotle and his school, Lyceum. They were later called the Peripatetics, because Aristotle, he liked to walk and talk and walk and teach, but there's an emphasis on empirical observation. Another thing this time is Epicurus and Epicurus' garden. Now Epicurus, unlike Plato and Aristotle, welcomes women to study in his school. Now, what we get in the garden, though, is something that is philosophy is a withdrawal, and it's not in the centre of Athens, but it's away. It's surrounded by beauty and greenness. It is very critical of the gods and any form of superstition. It aims at pleasure, but when we think of the epicure in modern English, our idea is somebody who's a hedonist, and this isn't about hedonism. What the Epicureans were about was a kind of contentment, a kind of joy, which is actually quite frugal. And another group, the Cynics, and the Cynics are also important when we think about the early days of Stoicism, because Zeno, the founder really of the Stoic school, wants to learn about Socrates, and so he decides to learn under Crates, who is a cynic. Now, what is a cynic? Well, a cynic isn't somebody with a barbed sense of humour in this period, although they might have done. And again, very little survives writing-wise of the Cynics. But it's a kind of school founded in Athens by Diogenes of Sinope, a man who lives in a barrel and who refuses to move out of the way, or who, when he meets Alexander the Great, tells him to get out of the way so that he can continue sunbathing. It's very irreverent. It's very critical of authority. But what the Cynics emphasized was living with nature, living according to nature, living very simply, having very few possessions, living almost very publicly, washing, drinking, eating, bathing, even having sex in public, living in a way that's not closer to nature, but also closer to animal nature. And so there's a kind of cynic, the word cynic comes from dog-like, living like dogs. Anyway, so it's interesting that Zeno studies under Crates, but also Zeno is a very interesting guy. We're going to find out more about him next week. He actually, in his life, ends up studying under a lot of different people. And what makes the Stoics as a school really interesting is that they draw on all of the elements above. And here's more statues and stuff. Right. Okay, I'm going to talk now just about the Stoic, where the Stoics were. And then I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about, and then I'm going to draw it to a close. Okay, so where do the Stoics come from in all of this? Well, we've met some kind of key people already. Socrates on the right, Aristotle in the middle, Plato on the left. Well, the Stoics, Greek Stoics, are around this time, but shortly after. And what Zeno does is he decides that he can't really afford, doesn't have the financial elsewhere, but he wants to meet and discuss philosophy in a public place, not like Epicurus in the garden. This is more like Socrates. And that's very interesting, because this is philosophy that is public facing, that is committed to public and civic activity. And maybe that also has a bearing in the Stoic philosophy much later of the Roman period. It's not dry, it's about how to live, and that's because it's rooted in these real and public concerns. So, where did the Stoics come from? I'm going to show you some images. This is just from history. So, from Sandbach. At the northwest corner of the Agora, the marketplace, the great central square of Athens, stood the Stoa of Poikile, or painted colonnade. So, when we talk about the word Stoic, Stoa, it's the painted porch. It's this kind of, I'll show you an image in a second, but it was somewhere that was public and had all this kind of public art attached to it. It was also the place of a major execution that had taken place a few years earlier. So that's partly also why Zeno could come and walk and talk philosophy in this place, and people would come and listen to him. If we imagine what this painted colonnade was like with these mural paintings, it would have looked like this, out of the sun. So what was taking place here? Let's go back to Sandbach. Quote, here in the early part of the 3rd century BC, could often be seen a seated figure talking to a group of listeners. His name was Zeno, and his followers, first called Zenonians, were later described as men from the Stoa, or Stoics. Right, I'll show you a couple more images on the map, in case you're kind of thinking, right, what do you mean? Garden, academy, blah, blah, blah. Here is Athens. The Agora is quite, it takes up a lot of space, I guess. And the Parthenon is there, up in the distance. Now on the left, you can kind of see where the schools all sit. The Agora in the middle, the Stoa Poikile kind of on the outskirts of the marketplace. Remember, Socrates is in the middle of the Agora. The garden, of the Epicureans is outside the city walls. The academy is even further, and the Lyceum is kind of slightly further away. And then on the right, you can see another image of the Agora as well. We've got, kind of religious buildings, the Stoa of Zeus. We've got these squares, a mint. Imagine what this would be like nowadays, if there wasn't a lockdown. This would be like, I don't know, like someone like somebody basically taking over that little square park thing in Leicester Square and just having free lectures and free classes and loads of people gathering there wanting to talk and debate philosophy. That's exciting. That's, not like what philosophy is like these days. In case you're wondering, right, well, lots of stuff in Athens is still there. What about the Stoa Poikile? Oh, they've excavated it, and this is what it looks like today. Not much. But in case you're thinking. Right, let's, in this final bit, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about Zeno, and then I'm going to set out some questions for discussion in our session on Monday. So, we remember Zeno, 30 years old, selling purple dye, travelling in a boat, shipwreck, near-death experience. Wanting someone to explain to him what really matters in life. Zeno is interesting. Zeno kind of has a bearing to Socrates in that he's also not high class. He comes from Citium, which is a Greek city, Greek town in Cyprus, but he doesn't have citizenship in Athens. And he turns it down later when he's offered it because he's loyal to Citium. His philosophy is, it's in the marketplace and it's about everyday life. So just let's think about the oracle here in ancient Athens, the one who told Socrates that he was the wisest. What did the oracle tell Zeno? Well, this is kind of interesting. It's quite weird, actually. It's funny, actually, no commentators ever flagged up the weirdness. Maybe this is me being weird about it. Anyway, he asked the oracle, what should he do to live the best possible life? And this is the answer that he got. The oracle said to him that he should join his flesh with that of the dead. Okay. So how do you interpret that? So luckily Zeno, being of a studious bent, decided that what he would do is just read the works of ancient philosophers. Now you might be wondering, what would those be? And of course that's what makes, the ancient period so interesting. Yes, we've got loads of Plato, we've got quite a lot of Aristotle, but actually tons and tons of work does not survive. Epictetus' work largely doesn't survive. Zeno of Citium's work does not survive. So much does not survive. We don't know what he was reading, but he was reading ancient stuff. So Zeno's kind of teaching, so far as we can tell, was simply, it kind of goes back to this core idea of living according to nature. He writes lots of works. One that people do talk about in historical record is this work called Republic. So who do you know who wrote a book called Republic? Well, you might think of Plato. Plato's Republic, yes. And Zeno writes a work with the same title, and it's a kind of a response. But whereas Plato, as you might know, philosopher kings, it's a very hierarchical, very elitist society. Not much time for poetry and music. Zeno's Republic, it's a shame that society is completely different. It's all about equality. Everyone lives under the same laws. It's got all sorts of curious features. Money is abolished. Men and women have a uniformity of dress. Worshipping in temples is attacked. It's a radical book. Again, like political philosophy past and present. Oh, it's daydreams, isn't it? Very, very intoxicating daydreams. So this is from a later source. Because Zeno's work doesn't survive, we have to kind of look at it indirectly. Athanasius. So Zeno apparently thought that love was the god of friendship and liberty, and the author of concord among people, but nothing else. And there's a quote from Zeno: love is a god who cooperates in securing the safety of the city. That's nice. Love is the basis of the collective good. Love being the god of friendship. Well, the rest we just don't know, but this is something that we're going to talk about next week. What can we piece together of Zeno's philosophy? Now, in this final bit, we're just going to go over a couple of bits of Zeno's thinking in a little bit more depth, and then we'll talk about all of this on Monday. We're kind of nearly there. Okay, so this is more like a short description of some things that he thinks, and this will give us a bit of a basis into what Zeno thinks. So, a quote from Zeno. Happiness is a good flow of life. Okay, what does that mean? How can that be achieved? So Zeno said that this good flow of life, this happiness, this contentment can be achieved, I'll go over this kind of slowly, through the use of right reason, but right reason coinciding with the universal reason which governs everything. So we're getting an emphasis here, and we got this in the later Roman Stoics, it's all about using our minds to develop a rational understanding for ourselves within nature and our own ideas and knowledge. But it's a little bit understated in the Roman authors, but it's very important so far as we can tell in early Stoics. They were very interested in physics, they were very interested in the sciences. They wanted to understand things as they are. And they believed that there was this universal reason, this kind of cosmic harmony or order, which is kind of reminiscent of Pythagoras, which pervades everything, logos. We need to tune our reason so that we are in the same key. I guess this sounds very Pythagorean, Pythagoras. We're in the same key as universal reason. But there's a sense that reason governs everything, but also our minds. Nature and earth can be intelligible to our minds. We are not condemned, as Albert Camus might think, to never really understanding this silent, uncaring cosmos. We can understand nature because there is something ultimately harmonious about it. So why do we feel afraid? And why do we feel sad? Why do we feel loathing and self-loathing and anxiety? Well, our Roman Stoics are going to give us some probably better counsel on this, but at least for Zeno, a bad feeling, pathos, is a disturbance of the mind, repugnant to reason and against nature. So if we feel these things, in some ways what we're thinking or feeling reflects being out of tune with nature, as it really is. We need to identify, we need to use reason, we need to understand our own feelings and values and ideas to become in tune again. True good consists only in virtue. Okay, we'll get that in every thinker throughout time. But here, virtue, think about what I said earlier, skill, arete. Virtue is strength of mind. Through strength of mind, morally good actions will follow. We're morally good not because, when I say strength of mind, it's not because, don't imagine here, someone who knows an awful lot about rocket science or quantum physics. This knowledge really is about human affairs, human society, and the human heart. And a true knowledge of these things and what makes people what they are will mean that we will have compassion and we will value and respect others. It also means that we won't have unrealistic ideas about them. Continue. One more slide on this and then we're going to wrap up. So for Zeno, everything is about reason. Virtue exists within the dominion of reason. Vice is when we reject reason, or when others reject reason. Zeno apparently also, he's definitely one for categorization, and we're going to see a lot more of this next week. He says there are 4 negative emotions: desire, fear, pleasure, and pain. Okay. He's also known for being quite frugal, quite ascetic. And there are 3 positive emotions: will, caution, and joy. Now it's interesting, isn't it, that pleasure could be a negative emotion in this way, hedony. But hedonism, this is kind of excessive sensual pleasure. But there is still something that's kind of, I don't know, is it aloofness here? But again, it's about reason, right reason. We root out the errors, we work out the inconsistencies and contradictions in our thinking as per Socrates, and we use them and correct them with right reason. This is just a really brief overview because we're going to be doing a lot more work on Zeno next week. And I'm going to tell you about the reading for next week in a moment. Right, so we're pretty much there. I'm going to give you some questions that I'd like you to think about after this. Maybe you could jot down some thoughts, and these are what we're going to discuss on Monday when we talk. What are your first impressions of Stoicism? What does Stoic mean? What has it meant to you? As you've been listening and watching this lecture and thinking, what makes Stoicism different to other philosophical approaches that you've encountered? Finally, and I want you to think about the structure of the course as well, what would you like to get out of the course? Are there any things that you'd like a particular emphasis on? Do you like the fact that I'm focusing quite a lot on ethics? Would you like a bit of physics or logic in there? Would you like a particular emphasis on anything? How timely do we want to go with this? The discussion is going to be between 1 to 3. It might not be 2 hours, maybe an hour or an hour and a half will be enough. I don't want to make these exhausting sessions, and I'm going to email you a Zoom link probably the day before. Okay, a couple of final quotes just to kind of get you going, and I'm going to tell you the task for next week as well. These kind of really recap what we've been talking about. Remember those 3 things: self-knowledge, compassion, living with nature. Epictetus says, "It is not things that trouble us, but our judgments about things." And Seneca, "Constant misfortune brings this one blessing. Those whom it always assails, it eventually fortifies." Okay, right, so for next week, try and get onto Moodle. You should hopefully receive a link for this quite soon. I want you to take a look at some readings that I'm going to send you. This is what I'd like you to read for next week. It's about 20 pages of stuff. Diogenes Laertius, who writes about the early Stoics later on, and Cicero. And I also want you to try and get hold of a good guide to the Stoics, or just try and read a couple of like web articles. It could be Wikipedia, it could be anything. Just try and read a bits and bobs about the Stoics before our second week, week 2. And so the book that I recommend is John Sellers. If you need any help, just send me an email. If you can't get onto Moodle, if something else isn't quite working, if you don't quite understand what Zoom is or anything like that, just send me an email on this address and I will try and get back to you as quick as I can. Okay, all right, so that is it for now. Stoics on Sofa. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and speak to all of you on Monday.